Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Mine was quiet, like a held breath, that no one dared to release. The air in my father's mahogany-lined study always tasted of bitter almond and old, suffocating wealth. It was a sterile, heavily curated environment where genuine warmth was meticulously filtered out by heavy velvet drapes and the relentless hum of a climate control system. I stood in the center of the Persian rug, my hands resting loosely at my sides, feeling entirely unmoored in the house I had grown up in. Across from me, sitting behind an expansive island of polished wood, was Arthur Sterling. He did not look at my face. He never looked at my face when the numbers on his balance sheets were failing. Instead, his manicured fingers moved with agonizing, mechanical precision. He was aligning 3 silver fountain pens in a perfect, parallel row against the edge of his leather desk blotter. Click, slide, stop. The tiny metallic sounds echoed in the cavernous room, sharp and rhythmic, filling the space where an apology should have been. Between us, resting dead center on the desk, sat a thick stack of legal documents bound by a severe black clip. I did not need to read the fine print to understand the gravity of the paper. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest from across the room. For months, the whispers of my father's collapsing real estate firm had drifted through the corridors of our home like a slow-moving poison. The missed calls from the bank, the sudden departure of the domestic staff, the frantic, hushed arguments behind locked doors. But until this exact moment, I had not realized that I was the collateral meant to balance the ledger. My father finally stopped moving the pens. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the brass nameplate, resting near his knuckles. "It is done, Clara," he said, his voice flat, entirely devoid of any paternal inflection. He sounded as though he were confirming the sale of a downtown commercial property. "The firm is drowning. The creditors are no longer asking politely, and the banks have completely closed their doors. Julian Vance has agreed to assume all our standing debts. Every single one of them. In exchange, he requires a legal union. You will move to his estate in the Pacific Northwest by tomorrow evening." I stood completely still. The silence in the room had teeth. It gnawed at the edges of my composure, testing the limits of my dignity, but I refused to let him see me bleed. I refused to grant him the satisfaction of my tears, because tears would imply that I believed he still possessed a conscience to appeal to. I stepped forward, my shoes sinking slightly into the expensive wool of the rug, and looked down at the top page of the contract. It did not look like a marriage proposal. It looked exactly like what it was, an asset transfer. A corporate merger born of desperation. My name, Clara Sterling, was typed in stark black ink right beneath the assessed value of Sterling Holdings. I was not a bride. I was a line item. Julian Vance. The name alone carried a heavy, terrifying gravity in the city. He was a reclusive billionaire developer, a man whose empire swallowed everything it touched, and whose private life was entirely hidden behind iron gates and towering forests. He was known to be cold, ruthless, and entirely unapproachable. And now, he was the man who owned my future. I looked at my father, studying the sharp line of his jaw and the graying hair at his temples. He was a coward masquerading as a pragmatist. He had sold my life to save his reputation, and he could not even grant me the respect of meeting my gaze while he did it. "Where do I sign?" I asked. My voice did not tremble. It sounded hollow, scraped clean of all the grief and terror that was violently expanding in my chest. Arthur's shoulders visibly relaxed, relieved that I was not going to throw a tantrum, relieved that his transaction would proceed without a messy, emotional scene. He slid the documents across the polished mahogany, extending one of the silver pens toward me. "Right there," he murmured, finally glancing up, though his eyes quickly darted away, unable to bear the reflection of his own betrayal in my face. At the bottom of the last page, I took the pen. The metal was heavy and cold against my skin. For a fleeting second, I looked at my own hand. These were fingers meant for holding charcoal, for mixing linseed oil and raw pigments on a canvas, for creating a world that belonged entirely to me. Now, they were merely instruments executing a debt settlement. I pressed the nib to the heavy parchment. The scratch of the metal against the paper was incredibly loud in the silent study. I signed my name in sharp, deliberate strokes. I did not hesitate. I did not pause to mourn the life I thought I was going to live. When the ink dried, the transaction was complete. I set the pen back onto the leather blotter, making sure it was perfectly aligned with the others. "I will pack my things," I said quietly. I turned and walked out of the study without looking back, leaving Arthur Sterling alone, with his pens, his ledgers, and the overwhelming emptiness of his salvaged empire. By the time the sleek town car crossed the county line into the Pacific Northwest, the following evening the sky had bruised into a deep, melancholic purple. Rain beat relentlessly against the cold glass of the window, blurring the world outside into a wash of gray and dark green. I pressed my palm against the chilled window pane, letting the freezing temperature seep through the glass and into my skin. It was a small, grounding sensation in a reality that felt entirely unmoored. The landscape had shifted drastically over the last 100 miles. The sterile concrete and towering glass of the city had given way to ancient, towering redwoods that crowded the winding road. Their massive trunks looked like the bars of a beautiful, terrifying cage, closing in around the car as we drove deeper into Julian Vance's secluded territory. Thick fog clung to the heavy branches, wrapping the forest in a damp, isolating silence. The car slowed, tires crunching loudly against wet gravel as we turned up a steep, winding driveway. Through the sweeping windshield wipers, the estate finally loomed into view. It was not a modern, ostentatious mansion built to flaunt new money. It was a massive, sprawling structure of heavy gray stone, dark timber, and crescent windows that looked like it had been carved directly out of the mountain. It felt old, heavy, and undeniably cold. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out, standing in absolute defiance of the wild nature surrounding it. The car rolled to a gentle stop beneath a massive stone portico. Before the driver could even open his door, the imposing wooden doors of the main entrance swung silently inward. Standing in the warm, dim light of the foyer was a woman in a crisp, spotless apron. She stepped forward as I climbed out of the car, the damp, heavy scent of pine needles and ocean salt immediately clinging to my clothes. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance," she said. Her voice was a low, respectful hum that did not disturb the profound silence of the property. "I am Gemma Thorne, the housekeeper. Please, come inside out of the cold." The title, Mrs. Vance, hit my chest like a physical blow, a sharp reminder of the signature I had left on my father's desk. But I kept my expression carefully blank, nodding as I stepped over the threshold. The interior of the estate was a study in shadows and quiet grandeur. The floors were slabs of cold, dark slate, and the walls were lined with rich, unpolished cedar wood that filled the air with a deep, earthy fragrance. There were no photographs, no bright colors, no signs of chaotic human life. It was a museum of silence. Gemma quietly took my damp coat, her movements fluid and entirely unobtrusive. "Mr. Vance is expecting you in the east corridor," she murmured, gesturing down a long, dimly lit hallway that stretched into the depths of the house. "He requested to see you immediately upon your arrival." My heart executed a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. The moment of my containment had arrived. I braced myself, pulling my invisible armor tight around my shoulders, preparing to meet the ruthless tycoon who had purchased my autonomy. I walked down the corridor alone, the soft sound of my footsteps swallowed by the heavy woven runner beneath my feet. At the far end of the hall, standing beside a towering window that looked out into the rain-lashed forest, was Julian Vance. He did not turn immediately. He stood perfectly still, a massive, imposing silhouette against the gray light of the storm. He wore a heavy, dark wool sweater and charcoal trousers, lacking the sterile corporate armor of suits and ties that my father always wore. When he finally turned to face me, the dim light from a nearby sconce caught the sharp, rugged angles of his face. He was striking, but entirely unapproachable. A deep, pale scar cut across the left side of his jaw, disappearing into the collar of his sweater. And as his hands shifted slightly, I saw faint, silvery webbing across his knuckles. He looked like winter stone, weathered, unyielding, and utterly guarded. He did not step forward to greet me. He did not close the physical distance between us, maintaining a vast, deliberate expanse of empty space. He simply looked at me, his dark eyes deeply observant, reading the defensive posture of my spine and the tight line of my mouth. "Clara," he said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, rough like dragging gravel, entirely devoid of the polished, manipulative charm of the men in my father's circle. It vibrated through the chilled air of the corridor, demanding nothing, simply acknowledging my existence. I waited for the rules. I waited for the list of duties, the expectations, the precise terms of my physical and emotional containment. I prepared to listen to a man outline exactly how he intended to use the property he had just acquired. Instead, Julian raised one scarred hand and pointed toward a small, antique silver tray resting on a narrow console table halfway between us. I glanced down. Resting on the polished silver were two items, a heavy antique brass key and a single sheet of thick, cream-colored parchment. I looked back at him, my brow furrowing in confusion. "The entire east wing of this estate is yours," Julian said slowly, his tone absolute and unwavering. "That key locks the heavy oak doors from the inside. It is your private space. I will not cross your threshold. I will not enter your wing without your explicit permission, and I will not demand anything of you that you are not willing to freely give. You are free here, Clara." I stared at him, my defensive armor suddenly feeling incredibly heavy and utterly useless against the steady, calm distance he was offering. I stepped forward, my shoes making no sound, and stopped in front of the console table. The brass key was solid and real, promising a physical barrier he was willingly handing over to me. But it was the paper beside it that made my breath catch in my throat. I reached out, my fingers trembling just a fraction of an inch, and picked up the thick parchment. It was a legal document, an annulment form, completely filled out in crisp, formal typeface. It cited irreconcilable differences, waiving all rights to contest, and granted me total legal emancipation without a single financial penalty or obligation. I traced my eyes down to the bottom of the page. There, resting on the final signature line, was his name, Julian Vance. Written in thick, heavy black ink, it was pre-signed. The document was entirely complete, waiting only for my signature on the blank line right beside his. My mind spun, trying to process the absolute paradox of the paper trembling in my hand. He had paid millions to acquire me. He had absorbed the catastrophic ruins of my father's empire just to bring me to this isolated estate. And yet, the very first thing he did upon my arrival was hand me the loaded weapon required to destroy the contract and walk away. I looked up from the paper, searching his scarred, impassive face for a trick, for a hidden clause, for the catch that always accompanied wealthy men. But his dark eyes held nothing but quiet, solemn respect. He had not purchased a prisoner. He had offered me a sanctuary, and then he had given me the immediate, unconditional right to leave it. Without waiting for me to speak, Julian offered a slow, slight nod. Taking a deliberate step back into the shadows of the corridor, he left me standing there in the profound silence of the estate, holding the brass key to my own locked doors and the absolute power to choose my own fate. The heavy oak door of the east wing closed behind me with a solid, echoing thud. I stood in the entryway of my assigned quarters, the brass key still gripped tightly in my palm. The metal had grown warm against my skin. It was a physical anchor in a night that felt entirely surreal. I inserted the key into the internal lock. The mechanism turned with a deep, satisfying click. It was a definitive sound, a boundary drawn not to keep me trapped inside, but to keep the world out. I walked further into the space, my footsteps muffled by thick, dust-covered rugs. The east wing was not a standard bedroom suite, or a gilded cage designed for a trophy wife. It was a massive, sprawling studio with soaring, vaulted ceilings. Enormous crescent windows faced the dark line of the redwood forest, letting the cold moonlight cut through the shifting fog. The pale light cast long, geometric shadows across the bare wooden floorboards. There was no bitter almond scent of my father's corporate study here. The air smelled of old paper, cold stone, and the faint, grounding fragrance of raw cedarwood. I walked toward a heavy oak desk, resting in the center of the room. I set the thick, cream-colored signed annulment paper down on the flat surface. It sat there, a blank check for my freedom, signed in heavy black ink by the man who had just purchased my entire life's debt. I did not tear it up. I did not put it in a drawer to hide from its reality. I left it exactly where I could see it. It was a constant, silent reminder that my presence in this house was now an active, self-authorized choice. Certain sanctuaries never announce their presence, yet they magnetically draw your weary soul inward. This room with its high walls and its heavy protective isolation, was calling to me. It was a vast vacuum, waiting to be filled. It was a space where I could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of Arthur Sterling's failing ledgers pressing down on my chest. I slept deeply that night, dreamless and completely exhausted by the emotional whiplash of the day. When morning arrived, the storm had not broken. The sky remained a heavy bruised gray, and the relentless rain continued to beat a soft, rhythmic drumming against the towering glass. I dressed quietly, pulling on a worn, oversized knit sweater and soft cotton trousers that I had packed from my old life. I walked to the thick wooden doors, intending only to crack them open to gauge the temperature of the corridor. I turned the brass lock. I pulled the heavy wood inward. I froze on the threshold. Resting on the woven runner just outside my door was a small mountain of supplies. There was no note attached. There was no ostentatious wrapping. No grand display of wealth meant to demand my immediate gratitude. It was simply a quiet, deliberate delivery of raw materials. Gemma Thorne had not knocked. The benefactor had simply left the tools I needed and walked away. I knelt on the floor, running my fingertips over the rough, unprimed texture of a dozen large linen canvases. Beside them sat 3 heavy wooden boxes constructed of dark mahogany. Their brass latches gleamed faintly in the dim hallway light. I unhooked the latch of the top box and opened the heavy lid. The smell hit me instantly. It was the rich, intoxicating scent of raw linseed oil, crushed pigments, and dry earth. Inside lay neat rows of professional-grade oil paints, sable brushes of varying thicknesses, and stacks of heavy sketching paper. But it was the contents of the smallest, velvet-lined compartment that made my breath stall in my throat. Resting in the dark fabric were several sticks of willow charcoal. I picked one up, bringing it closer to the gray light spilling from my studio. The charcoal had not been left in its standard, factory-cut cylindrical shape. Each piece had been meticulously hand-sharpened with a blade, carved down into a precise slanted wedge. I stared at the sharp edge, a sudden, heavy pressure building behind my ribs. This was the exact, unconventional angle I always used in my old city studio. It was a specific, tedious technique I employed to shade the sharp jawlines of my portraits, allowing for a broader sweep of shadow across the rough grain of the canvas. No one in my father's corporate circle knew that. Arthur had never once stepped foot in my workspace, dismissing my art as a frivolous hobby that produced no viable capital. But the man who now owned this estate had known. He had not just ordered a bulk shipment of expensive supplies to play the role of a generous captor. He had looked at my past work. He had studied the microscopic strokes of my shading. He had taken the time, likely in the quiet, isolated hours of the night, to carve the fragile sticks of carbon to the exact specification of my physical habit. It was an act of profound, terrifying attention. It was not a grand romantic declaration, but rather a quiet, undeniable proof that I was seen. I carried the supplies inside, piece by piece, locking the door securely behind me. I did not go out to look for my husband. I did not seek him out to offer a polite hollow thank you in the hallway. I understood instinctively that he did not want my verbal gratitude. He wanted me to work. He wanted me to reclaim the pieces of myself that my family had tried to sell. I spent the next 10 hours lost in the grueling physical labor of creation. I set up the largest linen canvas near the crescent window, letting the gray storm light wash over the blank surface. I took the slanted charcoal wedge and pressed it to the heavy weave. The scraping sound filled the vast room, harsh and rhythmic, echoing off the high ceilings. Gray dust settled onto my wrists, burying the faint scent of my old life beneath the rich, heavy smell of carbon and oil. I painted my grief. I sketched the sharp, jagged lines of the corporate betrayal, the suffocating velvet drapes of my father's study, and the dark, towering redwoods that now acted as my shield. My hands moved with a frantic, desperate energy, channeling every unspoken fear into the broad strokes of the hand-carved charcoal. The panic of the transaction slowly dissolved. It was replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of my own reclaimed voice. By the time the natural light finally failed, leaving the studio cloaked in heavy evening shadows, my muscles ached with a deep, satisfying exhaustion. I stepped back from the canvas, wiping my smudged hands on a spare rag. The painting was a chaotic, beautiful storm of raw emotion, entirely mine. I had survived the first day of my containment, and I had done it by building a world inside the walls he had given me. The house was entirely silent when the restless energy finally drove me from a studio. It was past midnight. The storm outside had softened from a heavy downpour to a fine misty drizzle, leaving the estate wrapped in a thick, damp fog. My hands were scrubbed clean, but a faint crescent of dark pigment still clung stubbornly beneath my fingernails. It was a comforting reminder of the day's labor, proving that I was still an artist, not just an asset. I unlocked the heavy oak doors, leaving the brass key resting in the latch, and stepped out into the shadowed corridor. The air was much cooler out here, carrying the deep, earthy fragrance of the cedarwood walls. I walked slowly, my bare feet making absolutely no sound against the cold slabs of dark slate. I had no specific destination in mind. I merely felt a quiet need to familiarize myself with the sprawling fortress that was now my home. I drifted through the darkened halls, passing closed doors and tall windows that offered nothing but the black reflection of the forest. Eventually, the faint, warm glow of a small stove light guided me toward the back of the estate. The kitchen was not a sterile, hyper-modern showroom of stainless steel and polished marble designed to impress guests. It was a vast rustic space built for actual use and quiet domesticity. Heavy copper pots hung from a wrought iron rack above a massive, worn butcher block island. The wooden counters carried the deep, softened grooves of decades of meals. It was a grounding, heavily textured contrast to the flawless, untouched surfaces of my father's corporate penthouse. Standing by the large porcelain sink, bathed only in the pale silver light of the moon and the low amber glow of the stove, was Julian Vance. He was dressed simply, wearing a soft, faded gray Henley shirt with the sleeves pushed up past his elbows. He did not look like the ruthless, untouchable tycoon the financial papers claimed him to be. He looked profoundly tired. He looked like a man who carried the weight of a very heavy sky on his broad shoulders, finding solace only when the rest of the world was asleep. I stopped in the doorway, suddenly acutely aware of my oversized sweater and bare feet. I expected him to tense, to demand an explanation for my late-night wandering, or to enforce some unspoken rule of the house. I expected the cold, transactional nature of our legal union to finally assert itself. Instead, he simply turned his head. His dark eyes locked onto mine through the shadows, registering my presence with a calm, unblinking focus. He did not speak. He did not offer a polite, forced greeting or a patronizing smile. He turned back to the stove, reached into the glass front cabinet above the counter, and pulled down a second porcelain teacup. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. I stepped fully into the kitchen, drawn by the quiet, unconditional acceptance in his fluid movement. I walked to the heavy wooden island and slid onto one of the tall, woven stools. A small iron kettle was just beginning to hum on the burner, vibrating softly against the metal grate. The comforting, herbal scent of dried peppermint and crushed chamomile slowly filled the air, mixing with the ever-present smell of rain and pine creeping in from the window panes. Julian poured the boiling water into a heavy cast-iron teapot. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. He let the leaves steep in the profound silence of the room. Neither of us felt the desperate, anxious need to fill the empty air with useless chatter. The silence between us did not have teeth. It was a soft, heavy blanket, offering a safe harbor from the ruthless demands of the outside world. He picked up the two delicate porcelain cups, carrying them around the island, and set one gently on the worn wood directly in front of me. "Thank you," I whispered. My voice sounded incredibly loud in the quiet kitchen. It was fragile and raspy from a full day of disuse, feeling entirely foreign in the hushed space. Julian gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. He sat down on the stool opposite me, allowing the wide expanse of the butcher block island to separate us. He wrapped his large hands around his cup, letting the thick steam rise and veil the sharp, rugged angles of his face. He stared down into the amber liquid, completely at peace with the quiet. As the dim amber light caught the surface of his skin, my eyes were drawn inevitably to his hands. In the corridor yesterday, I had only caught a brief, shadowed glimpse of the damage. Now, sitting mere feet away from him, in the stillness of the night, I could see the full extent of the trauma. A thick, silvery webbing of scar tissue stretched across his knuckles, winding up his thick forearms and disappearing beneath the rolled sleeves of his gray shirt. The scars were pale and raised, interrupting the smooth, tanned skin with jagged, uneven ridges. My gaze traveled slowly upward, following a particularly deep line that emerged from the collar of his Henley. It tracked up the thick, muscular column of his neck and sliced diagonally across his jaw, fading just below his ear. He was a survivor of something incredibly violent. Something sudden and catastrophic had left a permanent physical ledger of pain on his body. He was not a flawless, polished billionaire who treated human life as a sterile, untouchable game. He had been broken, and he had healed with the visible seams of his survival left out in the open for anyone to judge. He caught me looking. I braced myself, my shoulders tightening instinctively. I expected him to pull his hands away, to hide his damage beneath the table, or to offer a cold, defensive remark to shut down my observation. Men of immense power despised being looked at with anything resembling pity. They demanded to be seen as invincible, flawless monoliths of control. Julian did none of those things. He did not flinch, and he did not retreat into the protective shadows of the kitchen. Instead, he lowered his dark eyes back to the table. He lifted his right hand, the one bearing the heaviest, most twisted knot of scar tissue, and rested his thumb against the edge of his teacup. With agonizing, deliberate slowness, he began to trace the delicate, gold-leaf rim of the fragile porcelain. It was a mesmerizing, deeply intimate movement. It was the physical manifestation of absolute, conscious restraint. Here was a man with the power to crush my father's entire empire with a single phone call. A man whose massive hands bore the brutal marks of raw survival, carefully and gently handling a piece of china so thin it was nearly translucent. He was showing me, without a single spoken word or hollow promise, that his immense strength would never be used to shatter me. We were sitting in the dark, two guarded souls who had been treated as objects of utility by a cold world, quietly acknowledging the damage in each other. I looked at the dark charcoal pigment still staining my cuticles, a mark of my own desperate need to survive. I looked at the heavy scars anchoring his hands. I wrapped my fingers around my warm teacup, letting the heat seep into my tired palms. I leaned slightly closer to the center of the island, closing a fraction of the physical distance between us. The steam curled upward, carrying the soothing scent of peppermint and rain into the dissipating our faces. I did not look away from him, and for the first time in my entire life, I realized that I did not need to wear my invisible armor. The cold, terrifying tycoon who had bought my debts was the person who had ever truly provided me with a shield. We drank our tea as the storm raged outside, sitting together in the absolute safety of the silence. The weeks that followed our midnight tea bled into one another, forming a quiet, uninterrupted rhythm of sanctuary and creation. I spent my days locked inside the soaring, vaulted space of the East Wing, protected by the heavy oak doors and the brass key that remained a permanent weight in my pocket. The violent storm outside eventually gave way to a persistent, misty coastal fog that clung to the towering redwoods, casting a perpetual, soft silver light across my bare wooden floorboards. I did not leave the estate. I had no desire to return to the loud, transactional world that had viewed me as nothing more than a line item on a ledger. Instead, I stood before a massive, fresh linen canvas, blending raw pigments and linseed oil until my hands were permanently stained with the evidence of my own autonomy. I was no longer painting the jagged, frantic lines of my grief. I was painting the quiet, weathered strength of the man who had given me the space to heal. I worked strictly from memory, tracing the heavy, raised scars of his hands and the dark, unyielding focus of his eyes, learning the topography of his trauma through the slow, deliberate sweeps of my hand-sharpened charcoal. We rarely spoke during those weeks. We simply coexisted in the vast, cedar-scented halls, sharing silent dinners at opposite ends of the heavy dining table and passing each other in the dim corridors with slight, respectful nods. It was a profound, deeply peaceful distance. He never once crossed the threshold of my studio, honoring the absolute boundary he had established on the day of my arrival. The fragile peace of the house was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon by a sound that did not belong in the heavy silence of the Pacific Northwest. It was the harsh, aggressive crunch of tires locking too fast on wet gravel, followed immediately by the violent slam of a heavy car door. The noise echoed through the crescent windows of my studio, sharp and intrusive, tearing through the quiet focus of my work. I lowered my sable brush, a cold, instinctive knot of dread tightening at the base of my throat. I wiped my hands on a spare cotton rag, leaving a streak of burnt umber across the frayed fabric, and walked out of the east wing to investigate. I did not need to see the visitor to know who had arrived. The suffocating, bitter almond scent of Arthur Sterling preceded him, cutting through the natural, earthy fragrance of pine and ocean salt that normally filled the foyer. I stepped into the main hallway just as the heavy oak front doors were shoved open, without waiting on the housekeeper. My father stood in the entryway, bringing the frantic, sterile energy of the city directly into my quiet refuge. He wore a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed into place, but the pristine exterior could not hide the wild, desperate panic, tightening the corners of his eyes. Clutched tightly against his chest was a thick, overstuffed leather portfolio. It was the exact same briefcase he used to carry his collapsing balance sheets, the physical vessel of the debts that had ultimately cost me my freedom. "Clara," Arthur snapped, his voice sharp and loud, completely disregarding the hushed reverence of the estate. He did not ask how I was adjusting. He did not inquire about my transition into a new life, or my physical well-being. His eyes immediately darted past my shoulder, scanning the dim, slate-floored corridors for Isani's wealthy benefactor. "Where is he?" my father demanded, stepping out of the entryway and tracking wet footprints across the pristine woven runner. "His assistant has been dodging my calls for 3 days. The bank is demanding the next phase of the capital injection by tomorrow morning, or they are going to freeze the firm's primary operating accounts." I stood perfectly still, my bare feet grounded firmly against the cold stone floor. Choices vanish quickly when you are treated as collateral, when your autonomy is bartered away, and when your own father views your life as nothing more than a debt settlement. But I was no longer that helpless, cornered girl, standing in his mahogany-lined study, waiting for the gavel to fall. I was standing in a house that belonged to a man who had handed me a blank annulment paper on my first night. I looked at Arthur not as a terrifying patriarch who controlled my fate, but as a small, desperate man who had gambled away his soul for a corporate logo. "Julian is working in the South Study," I said quietly, keeping my tone low and even, refusing to match his frantic escalation. "You are not expected here, Arthur. You cannot simply arrive unannounced and demand an audience in his home." "I can do whatever is necessary to secure my investments," he hissed, closing the physical distance between us. With aggressive, entitled strides, he stopped mere inches from me, his eyes finally registering my appearance. He looked at my worn, oversized knit sweater, the messy knot of hair secured hastily at the nape of my neck, and the dark smudges of oil paint staining my cuticles. A look of profound, unmasked disgust twisted his manicured features. He looked at me as if a luxury car he had just leased was suddenly covered in rust. "This is how you pay me back," Arthur demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper that felt entirely toxic in the peaceful hallway. "I brokered the most lucrative merger in the history of this family to ensure your comfort, and you are wandering around his estate looking like a vagrant. You are supposed to be securing his favor. You are supposed to be playing the role of a devoted, compliant wife, so he signs the damn transfer papers without looking too closely at the margins." He reached out, his hand moving with the exact same mechanical precision he used to align his silver fountain pens, and violently grabbed the collar of my sweater. He attempted to yank the thick wool straight, trying to physically adjust me, to mold me back into the polished, silent product he had sold on his desk. "Fix yourself," he ordered, his grip tightening painfully against my collarbone. "You will go in there, you will smile, and you will ensure he authorizes the portfolio." I did not shrink away. I did not drop my gaze to the floor in submission. I stood absolutely rigid, the heat of my quiet indignation burning away the last lingering shadows of my childhood fear. I raised my own paint-stained hand, intending to strike his fingers away from my clothes and reclaim my physical space. But, before I could even draw a breath, The temperature in the massive hallway seemed to plummet to absolute zero. "Remove your hand from my wife." The voice did not shout. It did not echo with melodramatic rage or uncontrolled, theatrical fury. It was a low, resonant rumble, cold and heavy as a slab of winter stone, slicing through the tense air of the corridor, with absolute terrifying authority. Arthur froze, his fingers instantly going rigid against the wool of my sweater. Slowly, mechanically, he released his grip and took a frantic step backward, his polished leather shoes scraping clumsily against the slate floor as he tried to put distance between us. I turned my head. Emerging from the shadowed archway of the south corridor was Julian. He was dressed in his usual dark trousers and a simple, heavy cotton Henley, devoid of any corporate armor or intimidating suit jackets. Yet he completely dominated the cavernous space. His jaw was set tight, the pale scar cutting across his cheek standing out starkly against his tanned skin in the dim light. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on the older man who had just dared to lay a hand on me. Julian closed the distance between us with slow, deliberate predatory strides. He did not look at the expensive leather portfolio. He did not look at the obvious panic sweating through Arthur's immaculate suit. He walked directly to my side, seamlessly stepping in front of me to insert his massive, broad-shouldered frame as an impenetrable physical shield between me and my father. "Julian," Arthur stammered, his previous arrogance entirely evaporating in the face of true, unyielding power. He hastily lifted the thick leather portfolio, holding it out like a desperate, flimsy shield. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was merely instructing Clara on her duties. The bank is growing impatient, and we need your signature on the second phase of the asset transfer to stabilize the—" "There is no second phase," Julian interrupted. The silence following his words had teeth. It was absolute and devastating. He did not raise his voice by a single decibel, yet the sheer gravity of his tone seemed to crush the oxygen out of the room. Arthur blinked rapidly, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. I don't understand. We have an agreement. The marriage contract explicitly stated that, upon the formal union, my firm would receive continuous financial backing to clear the remaining ledgers." Julian stared down at him, his expression completely impassive, a terrifying mask of cold, calculated restraint. "The contract stated that I would absorb your immediate debts in exchange for Clara's relocation to this estate. You executed the sale of your daughter to save your own reputation. The transaction is complete. You have nothing left to sell, Arthur, and therefore I have no further use for you." "You cannot do this." Arthur's voice finally cracked, breaking protocol and rising into a shrill, desperate pitch that echoed pathetically off the high, cedar-lined ceilings. "My firm will collapse by Friday. The creditors will seize everything. You promised to protect the sterling assets." "I promised to acquire the only sterling asset that possessed any actual value," Julian replied softly, his scarred hands resting loosely, yet dangerously at his sides. "And she is currently standing behind me." He took one slow, deliberate step forward, forcing the older man to stumble backward toward the massive entranceway. "You came into my home without an invitation," Julian continued, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "You raised your voice in my sanctuary, and you put your hands on my wife, treating her as if she were still your disposable collateral. If you ever set foot on this mountain again, Arthur, I will not simply let your firm collapse. I will personally dismantle whatever splinters you manage to salvage, and I will ensure that your name means absolutely nothing in the city. Leave." Arthur stood trembling, clutching the useless leather portfolio to his chest like a life preserver that was already sinking. He looked at Julian, finally seeing the immovable, ruthless tycoon the financial papers had always warned about. Then, frantically, he looked past the broad shoulder to look at me. He was searching for a lifeline, waiting for the obedient, silent daughter to step forward, apologize for the misunderstanding, and beg for her family's salvation. I looked back at him, my expression perfectly calm, my hands resting quietly at my sides. I did not say a word. I simply watched the man who had sold my future realize that he had inadvertently handed me the ultimate, unbreakable shield. Arthur swallowed hard, a visible shudder running through his immaculate suit. Turning on his heel, he practically fled through the heavy doors, disappearing into the gray, misty rain. The sharp crunch of his tires echoed briefly on the gravel before fading completely into the vast protective silence of the surrounding forest. The sturdy timber slabs clicked shut, sealing the damp cold outside. The sudden absence of Arthur's frantic energy left the grand hallway, feeling incredibly vast and deeply still. I stood in the center of the slate floor, breathing in slowly as the faint scent of bitter almond was finally overpowered by the grounding, earthy fragrance of Julian's cedarwood environment. Julian did not turn around immediately. He stood facing the closed doors, his massive shoulders rising and falling with a slow, controlled breath. The absolute, terrifying authority he had just wielded to dismantle. My father's entire life was slowly bleeding out of his posture, leaving behind the quiet, exhausted man I had shared tea with in the midnight shadows of the kitchen. When he finally turned to face me, his dark eyes scanned my face with a heavy, searching intensity. He looked directly at my collar, where Arthur's manicured fingers had violently twisted the thick wool just minutes before, and a flicker of dark, unresolved tension tightened his scarred jaw. "Did he hurt you?" Julian asked. His voice was no longer cold or menacing. It was a rough, quiet whisper, carrying a fragile vulnerability that felt entirely at odds with his imposing physical presence. He kept his hands at his sides, maintaining his strict rule of never crossing my physical boundaries without permission, even in the aftermath of a crisis. "No," I replied softly, my own voice steady and calm in the hushed space. "He only ever hurt my pride, and I think you just permanently cured him of that habit." Julian looked down at his own hands, staring at the thick, silvery webbing of scar tissue that bound his knuckles. In that quiet, lingering moment, as the afternoon rain began to drum softly against the crescent windows overhead, I finally understood the true depth of his fierce protection. He had not banished my father simply to assert his dominance over a business deal. He had not done it to prove his wealth, or to show off his capacity for cruelty. He had done it because he fundamentally understood the deep, silent agony of being used. He was a man who carried the permanent, physical ledger of trauma on his skin. He knew exactly what it felt like to be commodified, to be forced into rigid, unforgiving roles by a world that demanded performance over humanity. By cutting Arthur's financial ties and throwing him off the estate, Julian was not controlling my life. He was actively dismantling the toxic system that had kept me imprisoned, ensuring that my choice to stay in his home remained entirely, unequivocally mine. "Tell me to stop," Julian murmured, his eyes still fixed on the dark stone floor, misinterpreting my silence as regret. "If you wish for me to reinstate the credit line, if you want me to save his firm, because he is still your family, say the word, Clara. I will authorize the transfer right now. I will not force you to bear the guilt of his ruin." I looked at the powerful, stoic man standing before me, offering to compromise his own absolute boundary, just to spare me a moment of internal conflict. He was giving me the power to undo his protection, placing my emotional comfort and autonomy far above his own righteous vengeance. I closed the physical distance between us, my bare feet completely silent against the slate. I stopped just a few inches from his chest, close enough to feel the ambient heat radiating from his skin. I reached out, my paint-stained fingers trembling just a fraction of an inch, and gently rested my hand against his thick forearm, right over the jagged edge of his deepest scar. He went completely still at the contact, his breath catching audibly in the quiet hall. "Do not sign the papers," I whispered, leaving my hand resting lightly against his strength, feeling the steady, grounding rhythm of his pulse beneath my fingertips. "Let the empire burn." The adrenaline crash was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, agonizing drain of warmth from my extremities. I stepped back from the man who had just dismantled my father's empire, my fingers slowly slipping from the rigid warmth of his scarred forearm. He did not try to hold me there. He did not ask for gratitude or attempt to capitalize on the raw vulnerability of the moment. He simply offered a quiet, devastatingly gentle nod, allowing me the space to retreat into the shadows of the corridor. I walked back to the east wing in an absolute, heavy daze. The slate floor felt entirely different beneath my bare feet now. It was no longer the cold, sterile surface of a stranger's fortress, but the solid foundation of a true sanctuary. I reached the heavy oak doors, pushed them inward, and turned the brass key until the lock clicked with the definitive, hollow echo. Then, the fragile dam holding back a decade of silent endurance finally broke. I slid down the rough grain of the wood, pulling my knees tightly against my chest, and pressed the heel of my palm against my eyes. The tears were hot, thick, and completely uncontainable, spilling over my paint-stained cuticles in a silent, suffocating wave. I was not mourning Arthur's financial ruin, and I was certainly not weeping for the loss of my old life. I was grieving the terrified, invisible girl who had spent 22 years trying to shrink herself into a perfect, compliant asset, only to realize she had never held any true value to the man who raised her. The studio was cloaked in the heavy, bruised gray light of the late afternoon. The smell of raw linseed oil and crushed carbon hung thick in the air, a testament to the world I was trying to build on my own terms. But in that isolated moment, with the adrenaline completely gone, the vastness of the vaulted room felt overwhelmingly empty. Faint footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. They were incredibly soft, deliberately muted against the woven runner, but I felt the deep, steady vibration transfer through the floorboards. The presence stopped right outside my locked doors. I held my breath, the tears freezing on my cheeks. I waited for the inevitable knock. I braced myself for the authoritative demand to enter, fully expecting the powerful tycoon to cross the boundary and manage the emotional mess occurring inside his property. The knock never came. Instead, there was a quiet rustle of heavy cotton, followed by the dull, muted thud of a large body sliding down the opposite side of the oak. He was sitting on the floor in the hallway, pressing his back against the exact same panel of wood that supported my shaking shoulders. The physical boundary remained entirely unbroken, yet the suffocating isolation in the room instantly vanished. We sat there in the heavy silence, separated by 2 inches of solid timber, our breathing slowly sinking in the quiet space. I heard you cry. I didn't like it. The voice vibrating through the door was stripped of all its terrifying, protective coldness. It was a low, rough rasp, thick with a profound, helpless frustration that he could not simply buy a solution to my pain. I closed my eyes, resting the back of my head against the panel. I am not crying because I want him to stay, I whispered, my voice cracked and fragile in the vast room. I am crying because I realized I was waiting for a rescue from a man who was only ever building a cage. A long, heavy pause stretched through the timber between us. Outside the crescent windows, the Pacific Northwest rain began to drum against the glass, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat matching the pulse in my throat. I know exactly what that cage feels like, the man on the other side of the door finally replied. He did not offer hollow platitudes. He did not attempt to diminish my grief by reminding me of his wealth or telling me I was safe now. He simply offered the raw, bleeding truth of his own survival, using the physical barrier of the door to share a vulnerability he could never voice face to face. They called it an industrial accident, he continued, his tone dropping into a hollow, detached register as he spoke to the wood. A structural collapse at a commercial site I was personally inspecting a decade ago. That was the official statement printed in the financial papers to satisfy the shareholders. I turned my head, pressing my ear flat against the oak, to catch the quiet vibration of his words. It was not an accident, he said softly. The board of directors knew the foundational supports were compromised. They had seen the engineering ledgers. They calculated that the cost of halting construction and rebuilding was mathematically higher than the potential liability of an isolated collapse. I was standing in the lower staging area when the steel gave way. They pinned me beneath 3 tons of twisted metal, because to them I was just an acceptable risk, a number that could be written off to protect the larger corporate empire. My breath caught sharply in my chest. The image of those massive, deeply scarred hands, the silvery webbing cutting across his jaw, it was not the result of a random tragedy. It was the physical receipt of a devastating betrayal. He had been crushed by the exact same ruthless, transactional machinery that Arthur had used to sell my future. I spent 6 months in a sterile hospital bed, unable to move, unable to speak, listening to the men who built my cage negotiate my severance package in the hallway. He whispered, the memory dragging heavily through his gravelly voice. When you are reduced to a line item, Clara, You lose the fundamental ability to trust any structure built around you. You look at every door and wonder exactly who holds the lock. I raised my hand in the dim light, pressing my palm flat against the cold wood, right where I imagined his broad shoulder was resting on the other side. That is why I left the annulment paper on the console, he finished, his breathing slowing, becoming shallow and painfully guarded. I needed you to know the door was unlocked. I needed you to know that my protection was not a down payment on your freedom. Closed my eyes, letting his quiet confession wash over the raw, aching wounds of my own betrayal. The tycoon had not bought a wife to assert his dominance. He had purchased a drowning woman because he absolutely refused to watch another human being crushed by the weight of a ledger. Julian, I breathed, speaking his name directly into the grain of the wood. You do not have to open the door, he replied instantly, his voice entirely devoid of expectation or demand. You do not have to say anything at all. Just know that you are the only thing in this world I will not allow to fall. He stayed right there on the floor of the shadowed corridor, a silent, immovable sentry guarding my physical space, until my tears finally dried, and the storm outside settled into a quiet, misty drizzle. The deep, coastal fog that perpetually shrouded the estate finally began to lift 3 weeks later, allowing the pale, golden light of early autumn to slice through the towering redwoods. The air in the east wing had grown distinctly colder, carrying the sharp, crisp scent of dying leaves and ocean salt through the slightly cracked crescent windows. I stood in the center of the soaring studio, wiping the heavy, dark residue of charcoal dust from my fingertips with an old, frayed rag. The massive linen canvas resting on the central easel was finally complete. I had poured countless hours of silent, agonizing focus into the piece, working until my shoulders ached and my vision blurred. I did not paint the ruthless billionaire the city feared. I did not paint the imposing, stone-faced developer who had banished my father to the rain with a single, terrifying command. I painted the man who sat on the floor outside a locked door. The portrait was rendered entirely in stark, shifting shadows and deep, bruised light. It captured the exact moment he had held the fragile porcelain teacup in the midnight kitchen, his eyes lowered in a posture of profound, quiet humility. I had used the hand-sharpened willow wedges to painstakingly trace the jagged, silvery lines of his trauma. I did not paint them as ugly deformities to be hidden, but as the beautiful, resilient architecture of his survival. The scars were the brightest points of light on the canvas, illuminating the dark, unyielding strength of his jaw. I set the rag down on the heavy oak desk. Beside it rested the thick, cream-colored annulment paper, completely untouched since the night of my arrival. The stark black ink of his signature looked incredibly lonely on the blank page, a constant reminder of the exit he had freely offered. I picked up the document, the thick parchment feeling heavy and definitive in my hands, and walked to the entrance of the studio. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the brass key that had kept the world at bay for nearly 2 months. I turned the mechanism. The heavy lock clicked backward, echoing sharply in the quiet room. I pulled the massive oak doors inward, leaving them standing wide open, casting a long, welcoming wedge of warm light into the dim corridor. I did not go out to find him. I simply returned to the center of the room, standing beside the easel, and waited. It did not take long. The estate operated on a quiet, unseen rhythm, and he was deeply attuned to every subtle shift in its frequency. Within minutes, the soft, muted sound of heavy footsteps approached down the woven runner. He stopped at the threshold. He was wearing a simple, dark, charcoal sweater, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He looked at the open doors, his dark eyes registering the broken boundary with a flicker of profound hesitation. He did not step inside immediately. He waited, his scarred jaw tightening, offering me the unspoken opportunity to change my mind and close the physical barrier. I offered a slow, deliberate nod. He crossed the threshold, his boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the bare floorboards of my sanctuary. The scent of cedarwood and cold rain followed him into the room, immediately mixing with the sharp, earthy fragrance of raw pigments and fixative. He moved with extreme care, as if the air in the studio were made of glass, and he was terrified of shattering it. He stopped a few feet away from the easel, his eyes finally landing on the massive linen canvas. The silence that stretched through the vaulted room was absolute. I watched his chest rise and fall, the breath catching sharply in his throat as he processed the image. Men of immense wealth spent their entire lives commissioning portraits designed to project power, flawlessness, and intimidating perfection. They paid exorbitant sums to hide their damage from the world. I had painted his damage as the most sacred, powerful part of him. He raised a trembling hand, the thick silvery webbing across his knuckles, catching the golden autumn light pouring through the windows. He did not touch the canvas, his fingers stopping an inch away from the painted rendition of his own scarred jaw. "Is this how you see me?" he whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse, stripped completely bare of his usual stoic armor. "That is exactly who you are," I replied softly, my voice steady and unwavering in the quiet space. "You are not a broken machine, Julian, and you are not a monster. You are the man who survived." He lowered his hand, his dark eyes slowly moving from the canvas to my face. The sheer, overwhelming vulnerability in his expression was completely unmasked, a terrifying and beautiful surrender of his pride. He looked at me with the desperate, quiet reverence of a man who had spent his entire life in the freezing dark, only to suddenly realize someone had built a fire specifically for him. I lifted my right hand, revealing the thick, cream-colored document I had been holding against my side. His gaze tracked the movement, recognizing the pre-signed annulment paper instantly. A sudden, cold tension gripped his broad shoulders. He braces himself, instinctively preparing for the transactional end he had always believed was inevitable. He thought the painting was a farewell gift. He thought I was finally claiming the freedom he had promised on my first night. I turned away from the easel and walked slowly toward the large stone fireplace set into the far wall of the studio. A small banked fire was still glowing softly in the hearth, radiating a dry, comforting heat into the cool room. I stopped at the edge of the stone hearth. I did not ask for permission, and I did not offer a grand, theatrical declaration of my intentions. I simply held the legal document over the low, flickering flames and let it go. The thick parchment caught the heat instantly. The edges curled and blackened, the stark ink of his signature vanishing into a bright, sudden flare of orange fire. The paper crumbled, the formal legal terminology, and the escape clause dissolving into fragile gray ash that drifted lazily up the dark stone chimney, entirely destroyed. Julian exhaled a sharp, shuddering breath behind me. I turned back to face him, the warm light of the fire catching the loose strands of my hair. I closed the remaining physical distance between us, my bare feet silent against the wood, and stopped directly in front of him. I reached out, my paint-stained fingers sliding gently into the center of his massive, scarred palm. He gripped my hand instantly, his fingers curling around mine with a desperate, crushing gentleness. He pulled me slightly closer, bowing his head until his forehead came to rest lightly against my own. We did not kiss. The moment did not demand the frantic, rushed urgency of physical passion. It demanded exactly what we were sharing, a quiet, absolute vow spoken in the steady rhythm of our shared breathing. "Write the life you want," he murmured, his breath warm against my cheek. His eyes closed as he held on to me, like I was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. "I'll meet you there." "We are already here," I whispered, resting my free hand flat against the steady, thumping pulse over his heart. The cold, terrifying transaction that had brought me to this mountain was entirely gone, burned to ash in the hearth of my own making. He had come to collect a debt, but instead, he had simply held the door open while I learned how to save myself. As the last light of day wrapped us in gold, I knew without a shadow of doubt that I had finally come home. Home isn't a place or a name, it's a person. And for the first time in my life, standing in the quiet sanctuary of his arms, I had absolutely no reason to run.